"Feed my children, and I'll protect you," he told the orc widow. Winter made him her only hope. By the third night of the Whitehorn blizzard, Frostwater Hollow had vanished beneath snow. Margaret Hawthorne stood inside the barn with one end of a rope wrapped around her powerful green hands. The other end disappeared into the screaming white darkness where George Fletcher had gone to save the only wind wall keeping the barn entrance from being buried. The rope stopped moving. 6 weeks earlier, the starving human widower had reached her gate carrying a 10-month-old daughter and leading a 7-year-old boy who hid bread because he no longer trusted tomorrow. George had looked at the tall orc widow, at her failing ranch, and made a bargain that sounded almost insulting. "Feed my children, and I'll protect you." Margaret had buried one husband, fought wolves alone, and refused every man who tried to claim her land. She needed no protector. At first, George was only a carpenter who could fix her barn. Then winter tightened around the valley. And when the rope went still, Margaret discovered there was one thing she could not rebuild if the storm took it from her: George. If you enjoy emotional Orc X human stories built on loyalty, survival and slow-burn romance, subscribe to Orc Bond Saga and tell me in the comments, would you have trusted George after hearing his strange bargain at Margaret's gate? Late autumn had already turned cruel when George Fletcher reached Frostwater Hollow. Cold wind rolled down from the northern mountains and flattened the dead grass against hard soil. Birch leaves skittered along the road like scraps of copper. Thin ice formed in ditches before sunset, broke under the weak noon sun, then returned thicker the next morning. George understood what those signs meant. Winter was early. He had spent nearly 20 years building against it. He knew how snow found weak roofs, how wind found crooked doors, and how trapped water became ice strong enough to split iron. Usually that knowledge earned him wages. Now it could not buy milk. 10-month-old. Maisie Fletcher slept against his chest beneath his patched grey coat. She had cried from hunger for 2 days. That morning she had gone quiet. George feared the silence more than the cold. His 7-year-old son, Alfie, walked beside the old handcart. George pulled along the rutted trail. The boy's boots were too small. One sole had been tied with cord. His cheeks were red from the wind. He did not complain. Before Charlotte died, Alfie had asked questions about everything. Why did smoke bend? Why did iron sound sharper in winter? Why did horses sleep standing? Why did adults say soon when they really meant I don't know? Then Charlotte Fletcher gave birth to Maisie. 2 days later, fever came. 6 days after, that George buried his wife beneath a birch tree. Outside a freight settlement he no longer liked to. Remember, Maisie survived. There, old life did not. George had always found wages with traveling repair crews, but 3 settlements had refused a carpenter who came with children. One offered work without beds for Alfie and Maisie. Another gave them 1 night. At the third, a merchant suggested sending Maisie to an orphan house. George left before the man finished speaking. By the 5th day, their food was gone. He found a fistful of grain in the bottom of the cart and boiled it thin. Maisie took a little. Alfie said he was not hungry. Later, George gave him their last piece of hard oat bread. Eat it. Alfie ate half. The other half disappeared. Inside his coat, George pretended not to. See, that hurt more than if the boy had cried. Alfie was saving food for tomorrow because he no longer believed tomorrow would provide anything of its own. Near midday, they reached a wind-scoured rise. Below them lay a narrow valley protected on 3 sides by dark pine ridges. A river curved along the lower ground. Smoke rose from a long timber house. Beyond it stood a barn. 2 feed sheds, fenced paddocks, a stone stable, and a handful of animals. George stopped. A brown and white milk cow stood beside the main trough. Near the barn door, a shaggy cream-colored goat chewed at a fence rail. Milker. George closed his eyes. Thank God. Alfie looked up. Can we stay? George wanted to promise. Instead he said, we can ask. They descended toward the ranch. His builder's eye began working before he could stop it. The property had been built well, but George immediately saw Winter's targets. Northwest-facing barn doors, willow too close to the approach, hay on damp earth, a dipping water line, and shrinking wall chinking, small weaknesses. Winter loved them. A figure stood beside the trough, breaking a thin layer of ice with the back of an iron hammer. George slowed. The ranch owner was an orc woman, full-blood northern orc, tall and powerfully built, with rich green skin. A curving athletic frame, a thick black braid, white tusks, and amber gold eyes. A deep, rust-red wool dress showed the edge of an old scar near one. Collarbone beneath her leather work vest. Nothing about her suggested a woman waiting to be rescued. Her eyes moved from George to Alfie, then to Maisie. "What do you want?" Her voice was low and steady. "Work. There's a human settlement south. They sent us away. Another east. My daughter doesn't have another too." Days. The orc woman looked at the baby. Her expression changed only slightly. "What work?" "Carpentry. Timber framing, barns, roofs, wagons, pumps, water lines, grain storage, wind walls, cold weather shelters. You're a carpenter." "Builder." Her gaze dropped to his left boot, where leather strips held the sole in place. "You don't look like much of one." "That is fair." Alfie stared at the ground. George swallowed his pride. "There are animals here." "Yes, which gives milk." The woman pointed with the hammer. "Bessie is the cow. Rosie is the goat." George looked toward Maisie. "My daughter needs milk." The woman said nothing. He could beg. Part of him wanted to. Instead, he looked past her toward the barn. The willow and the trough. Skill was the last thing he still owned. "Feed my children, and I'll protect you." One dark eyebrow rose. "Protect me?" George almost winced. "I know how that sounds." "Do you?" "Yes." She put the hammer down. "Human. Your boots are tied together. Leather. That makes the situation much more impressive." George almost smiled. "You are half frozen." "Yes." "You can barely stand." "Yes. I could throw you across that fence without much effort." Probably her tusks showed slightly. "Then what exactly are you protecting me from?" "Winter." The humor left her face. George pointed toward the barn. "Your doors face northwest. They have for years. The willow is too close. Hard snow will settle behind it and block the entrance." The woman glanced back. "Walter planted those trees." George caught the name. "Your husband?" "My late husband." He nodded once. "Then Walter built them for a different problem." Her eyes narrowed. "What problem?" "Spring wind." "How do you know?" "Old drift stains on your southern fence. Spring storms cross this basin differently." Her attention sharpened. George it pointed toward the hay. "The bottom layer is wet. You haven't touched it. The land slopes toward it, then the trough. That exposed coupling freezes before the buried pipe." "Anything else?" "Your west wall is leaking heat." "You inspected that too?" "Smoke pulls sideways near the roof. Warm air is escaping." For several heartbeats, neither spoke. Then the orc woman stepped through the gate. George instinctively tightened his hold around Maisie. She stopped before him. "Give me the baby." His body went rigid. "She needs milk," the woman said more softly. "I am not taking her from you." George hated how quickly his fear had shown. Slowly, he handed Maisie over. The baby looked impossibly small in the orc woman's broad arms. One green hand supported her head. The other closed around her blanket. Maisie made a faint sound. Something shifted behind the woman's amber eyes. "The milk comes first." George breathed again. "What about my claims?" "They can wait until morning." She turned toward the house. "My name is Margaret Hawthorne." The kitchen smelled of wood smoke, stew, dried herbs, and bread. Alfie stopped in the doorway, as if warmth itself might be a trap. Margaret heated Bessie's milk with a little water and a spoonful of Rosie's richer goat milk. She tested it against the inside of her wrist. Then she handed the cup to George. Slowly, his hands trembled. Margaret steadied the bottom of the Maisie drank too quickly. Margaret touched the cup. "Slow," George nodded. Margaret set venison stew and dark bread in front of Alfie. He ate fast. then slipped half his bread into his coat. Margaret saw it. So did George. Without comment, she placed another piece beside his bowl. You can leave that one. For tomorrow? If you want. You won't take it? No, Alfie looked at his father. George looked down. Margaret placed another bowl in front of him. I'm not. Hungry? You're shaking. Cold. You are not a convincing liar, George. Looked up. Do all your guests get ordered around? Only the foolish ones. He ate. Later that evening, Margaret opened an old foreman's room beside the kitchen. Boxes filled one wall. A narrow bed stood beneath a small window. Against the far side rested an unfinished wooden cradle. Margaret stopped beside it. My husband started this. George studied the carved mark on one rail. Walter Hawthorne? Her head turned. You know his name? It's carved above the barn frame. You noticed that already? He knew timber. Margaret's shoulders eased. He did. George did not ask how Walter died. Margaret told him anyway. A logging. Wagon rolled on the mountain road 3 winters ago. I'm sorry, so am I, sheep. Looked down at the cradle. One rail had never been sanded. We never needed it. George understood. No children. He did not fill the silence with comfort. That could not help. Margaret carried the cradle near the stove. Maisie slept inside it that night. Alfie took the foreman's bed. George slept on the floor beside him because he still did not trust good fortune enough to put distance between himself and his children. Before the lamp went out, he watched Alfie touch the bread hidden inside his coat. George turned toward the wall. He waited until both children slept. Then he covered his face and cried without sound. Before sunrise, Margaret found George outside without a hammer. He walked the ranch, tied wool strips beside doors, tested wall, seams, and pressed his boot into the damp soil beneath the hay. Are you planning to repair anything? I'm deciding what kills us first. I gave you 7 days. George looked toward the barn. Then we begin with hay. The hay work quickly became Alfie's scene. When George pulled away the bottom layers, warm, sour air rose. He laid old pine rails into a raised crib and handed Alfie a short measuring stick, 8 inches between stacks. Why 8? Enough for air, not enough to waste space. Did you test that? Experience. So you guessed. Margaret laughed. Soon Alfie controlled every gap while the adults carried and stacked. 7, he announced. George checked. You are right. Margaret folded her arms. The inspector has spoken. Another gap measured 9. George sighed. Any mercy? No. By midday, Alfie had charcoal marks for every completed row. When Margaret pushed one stack too close, he cleared his throat. 7. She stared down at him, then obediently shifted it. 8 now. Yes. At lunch, Alfie sat straighter. He still hid half a biscuit in his pocket, but George did not rush him. Trust needed more than one warm meal. That afternoon, Margaret found a charcoal mark beside the crib. Alfie, 8. She left it there. The waterline came next. That work belonged to Walter. George opened a test trench beside the trough. The pipe appeared less than 3 feet down. Margaret stared at it. Walter buried this. George nodded. He hated digging. There was humor in her voice, but pain underneath. George put down the shovel. We can leave it. Margaret looked at him. Why? I'm not interested in proving your dead husband wrong. Her expression shifted. He was wrong. About this pipe. Yes, that does not make him a fool. Margaret sat on the edge of the trench. For a while she looked at nothing. Walter built most of this place with his own hands. George waited. He could look at a crooked beam from across a yard and tell you which joint had failed. I would have liked him. He would have hated you. Why? You count too much. Good builders count. He said counting slowed a man down, and then buried this pipe too shallowly. Margaret's tusks showed. He would definitely have hated you. Margaret sat on the trench edge and looked toward the mountains. Walter meant to deepen it. Then calves came, his mother got sick, and the logging contract started. Her voice lowered. We argued the morning he died. About children. He wanted us to keep trying. I was tired of miscarriages and pretending each one hurt less. George said nothing. He told me we would finish the argument when he came home. He didn't. No, George did not touch her. The moment belonged to Walter. He tapped the old pipe. Then we finished the job he meant to finish. The pipe is good. Only the depth is wrong. Together they dug, talking about the dead instead of each other. Walter sang badly when he worked. Charlotte threw wooden spoons when annoyed. At sunset the line rested deeper. For Walter? Margaret asked. George shook his head. For everyone who still has to drink from it. That night, she placed one of Walter's old work gloves beside the stove, not as a shrine, simply where she could see it. 2 days later, they marked the new wind wall. That job belonged to conflict. George planted stakes 34 feet northwest of the barn. Margaret followed the line. No, he looked up. No? Move it closer. That creates a drift behind the wall. You are measuring the basin like a flat prairie. The ground rises near the southern arm. I counted for the slope. Not enough, George frowned. The old drift stains are from before Walter cut the drainage ditch. She pointed toward a shallow channel, nearly hidden under dead grass. Snowmelt runs differently now. George studied it. The ditch changed the surface still. He trusted the old wind marks. 34, 28. Too close. 30. No. Margaret folded her arms. This is my land. And you hired me because I understand the wind. And you told me proof matters. George's jaw tightened. Their first real argument had arrived. Fine. He planted 2 test lines and waited for the wind. Margaret hated waiting enough to feed Rosie, check Bessie, and return twice before a real gust crossed the rise. Snow dust lifted. At 29 feet, the slope helped the barrier drop snow safely short of the doors. At 34, George's line stood too far out. Another guest proved the same thing. Margaret said nothing. That made it worse. George pulled up his outer marker. You are correct. Her smile appeared slowly. Again? Do not ruin this. Louder. 30 feet. Final offer. Margaret laughed. The argument ended, but the lesson stayed. George knew the wind. Margaret knew this ground. They needed both. The wall created another sharp disagreement. George wanted the center tighter. Margaret wanted more open weave. Too loose, he said. The ridge already slows the lower wind. Then the upper wind curls down. Not if we angle the weave. Diagonal willow twists loose. Not tied at both crossings. That doubles rope. We use split hide low. George stared at her. Margaret stared back. Alfie quietly picked up Maisie's blanket and walked away. He had learned when adults were about to become stubborn. They built 2 test panels. A strong gust of wind settled it. George's tighter panel forced air upward. Margaret's angled panel spread the gust. Snow fell flatter behind hers. George closed his eyes. Margaret's tusks showed. No. I said nothing. You are about to. I was appreciating nature, George. He sighed. You were right again. Beautiful. I dislike this wall. You love this wall. I respected you more yesterday. That is because yesterday I had not defeated you twice. He finally laughed. The wall became theirs because disagreement made it better. Crispin Blackwell arrived the following evening. He was enormous even for an orc, dark olive-skinned, heavy-tusked, and wrapped in expensive bear fur that had never touched honest mud. 2 men rode behind him. One was Arthur Briggs, broad-shouldered, scar through one eyebrow, quiet eyes that missed little. Crispin dismounted. His gaze moved over George. Then the wall. So this is the human. Margaret continued tying Willow. He has a name. Does he? George Fletcher, George said. Crispin nudged one stake with his boot. Too far. George leaned on the post driver. You sure? I've run cattle here for 23 years. Then you should know what the ridge does to the wind. Arthur's mouth twitched. Crispin untied a canvas sack from his saddle and dropped it at George's feet. Inside lay a cracked wagon hub. My wheelwright says it needs replacing. George rotated the hub. He's right. Crispin smiled. So much for Margaret's miracle builder. The hub needs replacing, George pointed inside, but the collar is too tight. See the polished edge? Replace the hub without shaving the axle collar, and the next one cracks too. Arthur leaned closer. He saw it. Crispin took the hub back. You found that in 10 breaths? 12. Margaret hid a smile. The first visit was exactly what Crispin intended. A test, a chance to make George look foolish. It had not worked. Crispin's eyes turned cold. Hungry men become impressed when food is involved. Margaret stood. He works here. For now, he is my winter foreman. George looked at her. Crispin's gaze sharpened. Foreman? Until his work proves otherwise. Crispin looked toward the house where Alfie stood holding Maisie's blanket. Are you feeding all three? Margaret stepped forward. George moved beside her, not ahead. Beside, Crispin noticed. Winter will decide which one of you belongs here. He mounted and left. Arthur followed, but glanced once more at the wind wall before riding after him. Mabel Whittaker arrived the next morning with onions, goat cheese, dried apples, and enough opinions to fill a wagon. The elderly Orc widow had white hair in 2 thick braids and green skin faded by age. She looked at George, then Margaret. So, you found a human? I hired a builder. Can he cook? Badly, George said. Not husband material. Alfie laughed. The sound stopped them all. Mabel smiled softly. Good sound. Later, while Maisie held one of her fingers, Mabel's humor faded. You know why I bring too much food? My daughter died in the blue winter. Margaret knew only part of the story. Northcutt closed. Grain spoiled. Everyone thought somebody else had checked on them. No one had? George asked. Mabel shook her head. She was 24. Silence settled. After that, I decided embarrassment was cheaper than funerals. I ask rude questions. I count chimney smoke. I bring 2 loaves when one looks enough. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the bread in Alfie's pocket, then away. When Mabel left, Margaret walked her to the gate. You never told me all of that. You never asked. Grief is not a tax people owe their neighbors. Mabel glanced toward George. Remember that when you start believing, you must explain every wound before you are allowed to want someone again. Margaret stared. Mabel grinned. I am old, not blind. She rode away. George called from the yard. Was that about me? No. Poor liar. Margaret threw a glove at him. Cedric Winterbourne arrived 2 days later. The half-orc Winter. Reeve had grey-green skin, 1 broken tusk, silver hair, and the suspicious look of a man who trusted numbers more than confidence. He inspected the hay first. Who measured the gaps? Alfie, George said. Cedric looked at the boy. Any 7s? 1. Who made it? My father. Cedric nodded gravely. Expected. Alfie smiled. Cedric found weaknesses without insulting the work. The barn vent needed widening. The exposed water coupling still worried him. Charlotte's planned canvas curtain had to sit farther from the stove. At the trough he tapped the coupling. This freezes. It drains, George said. It sits in moving air. George crouched. Dry wool, wood shell, breathing space. Maybe. Margaret leaned toward George. He likes you, Cedric heard. I survived the White Horn of 68 because a neighbor refused to let my father walk outside. The wind took out half our roof. My mother kept 6 children under a feed platform while that neighbor chained the remaining roof to a wagon axle. George looked at the broken tusk. Why do you keep records? Afterward, every survivor remembered a different storm. Numbers showed what actually kept people alive. Cedric handed Alfie a pencil. Morning and evening temperature. Firewood, hay, milk, water, damp bedding, repairs. Every day? Especially when adults are tired. Margaret hung a ledger beside the kitchen door. Alfie became keeper of facts. The chinking failure arrived just as everyone was becoming too serious. George's first mixture cracked after 2 freezing nights. Margaret held wool beside the seam. It fluttered. Your expert wall is breathing. It is settling. It is whistling. George scraped the seam. Too much clay. My father sealed sheep sheds, Margaret said. Less clay, more chopped straw and animal hair. George mixed a new batch. Margaret made her own. Alfie insisted on a third. We need control. George stared at him. Cedric has ruined you. They labelled them A, B, and C. 3 days later, Alfie judged. A crack. Margaret frowned. B pulled away. George frowned. C wins. Both adults pointed at the successful mix. My hair, Margaret said. My scratch pattern. My straw. My ratio. Our mixture, Alfie said. They stared at him. He rolled his eyes. Our mixture. That should have ended it. Instead, Margaret smeared chinking across George's cheek. Accident, she said. George dipped 2 fingers into the bucket. Do not. You declared war. I own this house. You surrendered neutrality. She ran. A 6.5-foot orc widow circled the kitchen table, while George chased her with muddy fingers and Alfie shouted advice. Maisie laughed from the cradle. George never truly caught Margaret. She let him close once, trapped his wrist, and painted his other cheek herself. Her laughter filled the room. No grief, no almost confession, just ridiculous happiness. Later, Margaret washed her hands and watched George help Alfie update the ledger. A simple thought came. He can fix the barn. This time, it meant more than timber. Crispin's second move came without him riding through the gate. George had ordered tarred cloth, lamp oil, iron strap, and coarse salt from Red Crossing. The wagon arrived, then stopped outside the fence. The merchant would not unload. Blackwell. Freight controls our northern contract, he told Margaret. Crispin says anyone supplying Frostwater Hollow loses spring hauling rates. Margaret's jaw tightened. We already paid. I'll return the money. I have 6 employees, Mrs. Hawthorne. She stared at the loaded wagon. Crispin had chosen carefully. He had turned her survival into someone else's livelihood. George stepped beside her. Take the refund. We need those supplies. I know. You should be angry. I am. You look like you are making a list. Charlotte used to say I hide behind usefulness when I'm frightened. Margaret looked toward the road. My refusal is hurting your children now. George's expression hardened. Do not make his cruelty your responsibility. He chose this. The wagon left with everything still aboard. For the first time, Frostwater Hollow had lost something real because of Crispin. George asked what remained. Half a barrel of lamp oil, 17 days of salt, old canvas, scrap iron. Then the plan changes. They searched Walter's shed and found tarred canvas and lengths of iron strap he had saved. Margaret gave a bitter laugh. He never threw metal away. Smart man. He said ugly scrap becomes beautiful when you need it. George smiled. I definitely would have liked him. They worked until dark. The loss remained. Lamp oil was short. Salt was limited. But Crispin had shown his next weapon. Pressure. That night George searched the handcart and found Charlotte's old canvas roll. She had sewn it for freight camps. Leather strengthened the edges. Margaret watched him unroll it. You do not have to use that. We need another draft curtain. You would have to cut it. George stared at Charlotte's stitching. Margaret measured the doorway. Do not cut it. How? Hang the whole thing. They did. Not one stitch was removed. When the canvas settled between the sleeping room and main room, George ran one thumb across the old leather. Charlotte checked a child's wrist before checking the fire. Margaret stood beside him. Walter puts 2 cups by the stove every morning. The next morning 2 cups stood there again. Neither discussed why. Domestic life arrived without asking permission. Maisie learned Margaret's footsteps. Rosie learned to push open any gate George failed to latch properly. Bessie refused Alfie unless he sang to her. Unfortunately, Alfie had inherited George's singing voice. Margaret complained daily. George claimed Bessie had no standards. Alfie claimed Margaret was jealous. One afternoon, Alfie sat with Margaret shelling beans. After 10 minutes of silence, he asked, "Why don't you have children?" George stopped repairing a chair. Margaret's hands went still. She looked toward Walter's unfinished cradle. "Sometimes people build a room," she said, "and it never gets filled." Alfie followed her eyes. "Maisie slept there. That one is filled now." Margaret looked at him. Alfie returned to the beans. George said nothing. That night, Margaret stood outside beneath a sky sharp with stars. She remembered Walter, his terrible singing, his rough hands, the way he came behind her while she cooked and rested his face against the side of her neck. Grief had not become smaller. Life around it had simply started growing. The door opened. George joined her with 2 cups. He handed one over. For a while they watched the ridge. Then George said, "I miss Charlotte most when work stops." Margaret understood. In daylight there is always something broken. Yes. At night there is only memory. Yes. She looked into her cup. "I still love Walter." "I know. You still love her." "Yes." "Does wanting something new feel like theft?" George took a slow breath. "Sometimes." Margaret looked at him. "Then I remember Charlotte would probably insult me for being dramatic." Margaret laughed. "Walter would ask whether I planned to mourn him until I became unbearable. Were you unbearable before?" "Yes." Then weak argument. She bumped her shoulder into him. George nearly lost his drink. "You did that deliberately." "Prove it." The humor faded slowly. Margaret touched his beard with the backs of her fingers. George stayed still. "If I ask you to stop," he whispered, "I stop. If you ask me, you stop." She rested her forehead against his shoulder. His arms went around her waist. No kisses, no obligation, just warmth. That was enough, for now. A few mornings later, George found half a biscuit sitting openly beside Alfie's empty bowl. The boy had left the table. The bread remained. George stared. Margaret followed his gaze. He forgot it. "No." George's voice roughened. "He believes it will still be there tomorrow." Margaret looked through the window where Alfie was scratching Bessie behind one ear. Then she stood beside George until his breathing settled. Nothing needed explaining. Crispin's 3rd escalation arrived 5 days later. This time he came in person. Arthur Briggs followed. Crispin carried 2 documents. He handed the first to Margaret. "I bought the remaining Hawthorne note from Red Crossing." Her face went cold. George stopped near the barn. Crispin continued. "Payment remains due after Thor." That was already the agreement. "I can extend it." Margaret did not ask the price. Crispin handed her the second paper. The Southern. Freight road closes to Frostwater Hollow after the first major storm. George's jaw tightened. "That road has been shared for 11 years. Crispin looked at him. "You are not part of this." Margaret's voice hardened. "He is." Crispin returned his gaze to her. "I will reopen it if you transfer spring water rights to Blackwell cattle." "No, you have not considered the offer." "No, how much hay do you have?" Margaret said nothing. 19 days. George knew immediately that Crispin had obtained their old feed numbers. "Under old use," George said. Crispin smiled. "Winter does not care about your new theories. Neither does hunger. That is why we measure." Margaret folded both documents. This time the papers mattered. "Get off my land." Crispin mounted. Before turning, he looked toward Alfie and Maisie. "Pride becomes expensive when children are involved." George stepped forward. Margaret's hand caught his chest, not to protect Crispin, to keep George from giving the man what he wanted. Crispin smiled and rode away. Arthur remained a moment longer. His scarred brow tightened. He looked at the wind wall, then at George. "Hard weather is coming, so are we." Arthur nodded once and followed Crispin. After they vanished, George asked, "How many days?" "Old use." 19. Ledger? 23. Maybe 24. Prepare for 28. Margaret looked at him. "How?" "We already found most of the waste." Move the feed closer, keep animals warm enough to burn less, protect water, separate weak stock, waste nothing, no new supplies, old materials, no road, then we do not depend on a road. Debt? George paused. Spring problem. Margaret almost laughed. You think winter waits politely because we have categories? No. He looked toward the grey sky. But I can only fight one disaster at a time. She opened Alfie's ledger, wrote 28, underlined it. Then Margaret crossed the yard to the tool shelf, lifted Walter's old hammer, and placed it directly into George's hand. He looked at the hammer, then at her. She said nothing. Neither needed words. 3 days before Whitehorn arrived, the animals knew first. Bessie turned her back to the northwest and refused open pasture. Rosie crowded close to the barn wall. Birds disappeared. Clouds sank low over the ridge. At sunset, the wind stopped completely. George stepped outside. No. Margaret joined him. Whitehorn? He nodded. You're sure? I survived one 12 years ago. Cedric's warning arrived less than an hour later. Whitehorn front confirmed, winds above 60 miles per hour. Temperatures may fall below 25 under zero. No travel after first snow. George folded the notice. Preparation ends now. They worked through the night. Hay moved closer but stayed ventilated. The cistern filled. Bessie moved into the protected barn section. Rosie received a smaller pen near the warm wall because Margaret suspected the goat might be carrying twins. Firewood came inside. Lamp oil was rationed. Guide ropes linked the house, barn and storage shed. Red-topped marker posts went into the yard every 18 feet. Alfie helped. Why both rope and posts? A rope keeps you from wandering, George said. Posts tell you whether you are still going somewhere. Margaret searched the old shed. She returned carrying a weathered stake marked with Walter's carving. She placed it nearest the house. George quietly reinforced his repair bag using one of Charlotte's old leather straps. Nothing useful was left behind. Mabel stopped on her way south. She left goat cheese, dried apples, and preserved beans. You coming? She asked Margaret. No. The children? Too late to move them safely. Mabel looked at George. Are you staying? Yes. Good. Margaret narrowed her eyes. What? I was deciding whether to hit him if he abandoned you. George nodded seriously. Reasonable. Margaret pointed toward the pony. Leave. Mabel climbed into the saddle. Before riding away, she looked back at Margaret. Being able to stand alone does not mean you are required to. Margaret's eyes moved to George. I remember. Snow began before dawn. The first blast came from the northwest. The wind wall bent. Eld snow settled where Margaret and George had predicted after their argument, safely short of the barn doors. The offset passage broke the direct gust. Bessie stayed calm. Rosie complained about everything. Water flowed. Then it drained. The house held heat behind Charlotte's canvas. For several hours, every small decision worked. By noon, the valley disappeared. Margaret crossed between house and barn, clipped to the guide rope. George did the same. No one traveled alone. Alfie counted red marker posts from the window. By afternoon, he could see 4, then 3. At dusk, pounding came from beyond the wind wall. George stopped again. 3 dull knocks. Margaret caught his sleeve. Could be timber. Could be someone. He clipped onto the rope. 15 minutes. If I find somebody, 20. George raised her hand and kissed the back of it once. I'll return. Do not promise what weather controls. Then I will work very hard not to embarrass myself. He entered the white. The storm swallowed him almost immediately. George crawled marker to marker. At the 3rd, he found blood on the snow. Arthur Briggs lay half-buried beside it. Crispin's man. The same orc who had watched every confrontation without speaking. George rolled him over. Arthur's lips were blue. Red, he whispered. I know. Saw the post. That is why it is there. Horse gone. Save your breath. George tied Arthur to the guide rope, dragged, crawled, dragged again. 27 minutes after leaving, he reached the barn. Margaret nearly tore the door off opening it. Together they warmed Arthur slowly. Dry blankets, warm clothes, small drinks. No direct flame. When Arthur could speak, his voice shook. Blackwell North barn roof split. "Water?" George asked. "Frozen." "Cattle? Packed against one wall?" Arthur closed his eyes. "Crispin sent us to clear the southern road." "In this?" Margaret asked. "He wanted it open for his herd." George's jaw tightened. Arthur looked toward Charlotte's canvas. "I laughed at your wall." George said nothing. "I would be dead without your red posts." Then laughed tomorrow. The storm worsened overnight. The temperature dropped. Wind hammered the house. Then Rosie began screaming. Margaret entered the barn and crouched beside her. "Damn!" George followed. "What? She's kidding! Now!" Apparently she did not read Cedric's warning. Alfie arrived with the lantern. Margaret examined Rosie. Her face changed. "One kid is wrong. Can you turn it?" "I have done it once." George washed his hands in warm water. "Then you have done it once more than me." Margaret looked at him. "You hold her." Rosie objected violently. George wrapped both arms around the goat. "This animal hates me. She hates everyone." Comforting, Alfie held the lantern. Margaret worked slowly. The first kid came breech, small, wet still. George rubbed it with dry straw. Nothing. Margaret cleared its mouth. "Come on." Alfie silently handed her a cloth. George rubbed harder. The kid jerked, a tiny breath, then another, Rosie answered with a weak bleat. Alfie laughed. Margaret barely had time to smile. Second. The second kid came easier. Within minutes, both lay on dry bedding beside their mother. George sat back against the stall. Margaret leaned into his shoulder for one brief second. Warm water had made clean hands possible. Dry bedding protected the newborns. The wind wall kept the entrance clear. The offset passage kept Rosie from panicking. Alfie's ledger told them exactly how much lamp oil remained. No single repair had saved the kids. Everything had. Arthur, still weak, sat inside the house warming Maisie's bottle. No one stood outside the work anymore. The second night, Whitehorn tightened around the valley. Margaret woke restless, not only from fear. Deep winter always brought a physical pull she had learned to endure alone. 3 winters without Walter had taught her to cool herself at open doors, work until exhausted, and wait for the heat beneath her skin to pass. Now George slept 1 room away. That made restraint harder. She found him checking the stove. He looked at her once, then again. "You all right?" "No." "Storm?" "Partly." Understanding entered his eyes. Margaret growled softly. "Do not look pleased." "I am terrified." Good answer. He did not move closer. That restraint made her want him more. Margaret caught the front of his shirt. If there were no children in that room... George's breath changed. "Margaret." "I know." She released him. George took her hand, kissed her knuckles, then the inside of her wrist. Heat sharpened through her. Margaret bent and pressed her mouth to his neck. George closed his eyes. She kissed his shoulder. His hand settled at her waist. For several breaths, the storm disappeared. Then George stopped. Margaret looked at him. "Why?" "Because if tomorrow goes badly, I do not want tonight chosen because we were afraid." Her expression softened. "You think too much." "Yes." "It is exhausting." "Yes." She rested her forehead against his shoulder. "After the storm, if you still want me." Margaret smiled against his shirt. "That is the foolishest thing you have said since arriving." The third day brought the hardest wind. Just after noon, a deep crack sounded outside. The north section of the willow wall jumped. One lashing snapped, then another. The woven panel lifted. George's face changed. If that section goes, wind hits the entrance. And then, snow packs the barn doors. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. Margaret grabbed her cloak. George stopped her. "No, I am stronger. That is why you hold the rope." I can repair it faster. You cannot see the brace pattern in whiteout. You can explain it. And if the panel knocks you down, who pulls you back? Margaret hated him for being right. George tied the guide rope around his waist. 3 tugs, give line. 2, pull. 1, I'm alive. And none. George looked at her. Wait. Margaret's jaw tightened. No. He softened. I buried one husband after he left in winter. George froze. She continued. I will not stand here holding another empty rope. Margaret, you came asking me to feed your children. Yes. You promised to protect me. Yes. I release you from that promise. George stepped close. He lifted her large green hand, kissed her fingers, then her wrist. I am not doing this because I owe you. Then why? He looked directly into her amber eyes. Because I love you. Margaret stopped breathing. George walked into the storm before she could answer. The rope moved, first marker, second, third, then a violent jerk. Margaret braced. The line slid, then stopped. George? Nothing. The wind screamed, her mind filled with Walter, his body beneath a blanket. His boots are still muddy, his hand was already cold. Not again. Not George. For weeks she had measured George by usefulness, then trust, then the strange peace his children brought into her house. Now all practical thought vanished. A ranch could be rebuilt, a wall was replaced, debt renegotiated, but she could not stand another grave. The rope jerked 3 times. Margaret almost collapsed. More lines. She fed it. Outside, George had been struck by the loose willow lattice. The panel knocked him flat. His repair bag tore open. Tools disappeared into the snow. The bag itself flew away, then stopped. Charlotte's leather strap held. George dragged it back. Inside remained Walter's hammer, 1 short coil of rope, 1 spare brace. Enough. He crawled to the damaged section. The wall did not need rebuilding. It only needed to survive. George wedged the brace diagonally, wrapped the rope, hammered until his fingers became numb. Walter's hammer struck wood. Charlotte's strap held George's tools. The dead helped the living again. He turned toward home. The rope guided him. 1 marker, 2. He fell, rose, fell again. Margaret finally saw a shadow. She ran. George collapsed into her arms. It'll hold, he gasped. How long? Morning. Margaret dragged him toward the barn. Morning is enough. His knees failed. She lifted him in both arms. George opened one eye. This is humiliating. Good. Alfie must never see this. Alfie stood in the inner doorway. Too late. George groaned. Even Margaret laughed. She carried him beside the stove. His fingers were pale. Margaret warmed them slowly beneath blankets. George shivered hard. Maisie began crying. Arthur, still weak, lifted the bottle from warm water. I've got her. George looked toward him. Arthur shrugged. I owe you. No, George's teeth chattered. You don't. Arthur looked at Maisie. Then I choose too. Margaret heard that. Choice, not debt. She sat beside George. You said you loved me. He opened his eyes. Terrible timing. Was it true? Yes. Margaret bent, pressed a firm kiss to the side of his neck, then another to his shoulder. Then she lifted his hand and kissed his knuckles. George exhaled. I assume that is a response. Do not make me say it while you are half frozen. Why? Because if you die afterward, I will kill you. That seems difficult. Try me. His fingers closed weakly around hers. Margaret stayed beside him until dawn. By the 4th morning, the wind weakened. No one celebrated, they counted. Bessie is alive. Rosie is alive. Both newborn goat kids are alive. Hay dry, water flowing. Barn doors open. Firewood remaining. Arthur standing. George walked badly, but walked. The wind wall leaned. 2 marker posts had broken. The water box roof had cracked. George opened his notebook. Margaret watched him write. What are you recording? Weak brace, shallow post, loose upper weave. You survived. Yes. The animals survived. Yes. The children survived. Yes. You told me you loved me. George's pencil stopped. Margaret took his hand. I love you too. No grand speech, no bargain repeated, just the truth. George's eyes closed. Margaret continued, I still love Walter. I know. You still love Charlotte. Yes. Good. He looked at her. Good. If old love disappeared whenever new love arrived, neither would mean much. George raised her hand, kissed it. Margaret lowered her mouth to his shoulder. The storm had not erased grief. It had simply proved there was room beside it. If Margaret and George's bond has earned your attention by this point, subscribe to Orc Bond Saga for more emotional Orc X human stories. And comment below, was George protecting Margaret, or had Margaret been protecting George long before either of them understood it? When the roads finally opened, people came to Frostwater Hollow for answers. Cedric arrived first, then Mabel, neighbouring ranchers, and finally Crispin. Blackwell's north barn had lost part of its roof. 4 cattle were dead, and another group had gone almost a day without water. Arthur stood at Margaret's gate. You coming? Crispin asked. Tomorrow. Fletcher still can't use both hands properly. Crispin did not like the answer, but let it stand. Cedric read Alfie's ledger, checked the hay, water, barn, and damaged wall, then closed the book. Less wood, less hay. Stable water. Dry bedding, George nodded. Cedric looked at the repaired brace. Part of your wall failed? Yes. And the barn remained open. Good systems fail slowly enough for people to save them. Crispin walked to the wind wall. How far? 30 feet here, George said. Margaret corrected for the rise. Crispin glanced at her. She smiled. Open weave? Never solid. Diagonal? Margaret's idea. Water, deep line, full drainage. Protect exposed metal. Crispin looked at George. Show me. George did. No gloating, no revenge. When they returned, Crispin stood beside his horse. I was wrong. Margaret raised her eyebrows. I'd like that in writing. He glared, then tore the road notice. The southern route stays open. Hawthorne spring rights remain Hawthorne rights. I'll remove the freight pressure. In writing, Margaret said. Crispin sighed. Before mounting, he looked at George. Send me the wall measurements. I will. After he left, Mabel leaned toward Margaret. He hates losing. I know. He hates learning from humans more. Margaret smiled. Then today was educational. That evening, she led George into the ranch office. A document waited on the desk. He unfolded it. A share of the ranch profits, authority over structures, water, and winter preparation. Then one final line, Alfie Fletcher and Maisie Fletcher shall always have a home at Frostwater Hollow, regardless of any change between Margaret Hawthorne and George Fletcher. George read it twice. Margaret, no argument. You wrote my children into the ranch. Yes. Even if we fail, children should not become homeless because adults become broken. His eyes filled. He signed. That night, for the first time since Whitehorn began, no emergency demanded them. The children slept. Bessie was quiet. Rosie and her 2 kids were warm. No wall needed repair before morning. Margaret stood beside the stove. George joined her. The storm is over, she said, mostly. And I still want you. He held her gaze. Because winter says so. No. Because I fixed the wall. No. Because Maisie needed milk. Margaret lifted his hand and kissed his knuckles. Because you stayed when you could have left. George kissed her palm. And I want you because you fed my children before you believed one word I said. Margaret's mouth moved to his neck, then his shoulder. George kissed the scar near her collarbone and the curve of her shoulder. They had no need for kisses on the lips. For Margaret, his mouth against her neck felt more intimate anyway. What followed remained theirs. Warmth beneath blankets, hands that asked instead of assumed, nervous laughter, and pleasure neither used to erase the dead. Once Margaret went still, George stopped. Walter, she nodded. Do you want me to move? No. Just stay. He stayed. Later, George admitted the first time he desired her, he had chopped wood until his arms hurt because feeling alive had made him feel disloyal to Charlotte. Margaret laughed softly. Idiot. Yes. No regret? No. Guilt? Yes. Me too. George traced his thumb over her hand. That means they mattered. Margaret kissed his shoulder. And this? This matters too. They slept. The remaining winter needed no second climax. There were ordinary repairs, a sick goat kid that recovered, and small arguments over feed and firewood. They learned each other in quieter ways. George learned Margaret needed silence after nightmares. Margaret learned he checked the pantry whenever low stores reminded him of the road, so she began giving him the numbers before he asked. He also learned she still could not enter Walter's old workshop easily. One afternoon he repaired its door from outside. You can use that room, Margaret said. No. Why? You have not decided what it will become. I don't know. Then it waits. She understood what he was giving her. Not possession. Time. Mabel continued visiting at inconvenient moments. Once she found Margaret kissing George's neck behind a feed partition. George hit his head on a beam while stepping away. Mabel stared at him. I am 72. I have seen necks before. Margaret threatened to throw her into a snowbank. Mabel only laughed. The ranch felt alive, not perfect, alive. Spring came in small signs. Snow softened along south-facing hills. Birds returned. The river darkened beneath thinning ice. Alfie became louder. Maisie learned to stand while holding furniture. One morning Margaret was kneading bread when Maisie pulled herself upright beside the table. The baby reached both arms. Ma? Margaret stopped. George stopped. Alfie looked up from the ledger. Maisie tried again. Ma! Margaret's amber eyes filled. I did not teach her that. George's throat tightened. I know. Alfie! He raised both hands. Not me! Maisie reached. Ma! Margaret lifted her. The baby immediately grabbed one tusk. Margaret laughed through tears. George turned away instinctively to give her privacy. She caught the back of his shirt. Do not. He turned. Margaret held Maisie between them. George kissed Margaret's hand. She pressed her mouth to his shoulder. Alfie looked down at the ledger as though numbers had suddenly become very interesting. The wedding happened in early May, not because the valley demanded it, not because George needed ownership, not because Margaret needed respectability. They married because both wanted to name what they had built. Margaret wore deep forest green with bronze embroidery along the neckline and sleeves. Her black hair fell mostly loose, with 2 small braids at the temples. George wore the patched grey coat he had arrived in. Margaret stared at it. You own better clothes. I know. That coat has 4 different fabrics. Yes, that is not a point in its favour. George touched one patch. This is what I wore when I found home. Margaret's expression softened. You are painfully sentimental. You are marrying me. Not yet. Mabel cried through the ceremony while loudly denying it. Cedric served as witness. Arthur brought cider from Blackwell stores. Crispin did not attend, but before sunrise someone left a neat bundle of straight willow poles beside the gate. No note, Margaret knew. She smiled anyway. After the papers were signed, Alfie approached. Do I call you something else now? Margaret crouched. What do you want to call me, he thought. Margaret. Then Margaret. You won't be upset? You never owe me a word you do not mean. He nodded. For several weeks it stayed with Margaret. Then Alfie tripped near the marker posts and scraped both hands. Margaret ran toward him. Alfie, he looked up. Margaret, I'm fine. Both froze. His face turned red. I meant, Margaret knelt. Didn't hear anything. He stared. She inspected his hands. Didn't hear what? His mouth twitched. My hands hurt, Ma. Margaret pulled him against her. George stood nearby pretending to study a fence post. He failed to hide his smile. Summer changed Frostwater Hollow without erasing what winter had taught it. Cedric used Alfie's ledger to create a winter guide for northern farms. The first page listed no heroic names, only rules: measure, prepare, leave air, protect water. Mark paths, correct mistakes early Mabel. Insisted on adding one unofficial line, check. Your neighbors even when they say, They are fine, Cedric argued. Mabel won. Crispin rebuilt his barn entrance. Arthur installed red marker. Posts across Blackwell land. Merchants returned. The southern road. Agreement became permanent. At Frostwater Hollow, George and Margaret repaired the wind wall side by... See, now their arguments had rules. No insulting the dead. No pretending fear was logic. No saying fine when either meant angry. Margaret claimed George created most of the rules. George claimed Margaret created most of the reasons. Alfie agreed with both. Maisie learned to walk near the barn. Margaret knelt several steps away. Come. Maisie wobbled 1. Step 2. George stood beside Bessie. Come on. Little bird. Maisie ignored him. Her eyes remained fixed on Margaret. Ma! Another step, then another. She fell against Margaret's chest. Margaret lifted her high. Maisie laughed. George watched them. For a moment the whole road returned. Charlotte's grave, the empty food sack, Alfie hiding. Bread. Maisie was too tired to cry. Margaret standing beside the trough with a hammer. Feed my children, and I'll protect you. He had believed it was a bargain. Milk for work, shelter for repairs, food for protection. He had been wrong. Margaret fed his children, then she gave them a routine. Warmth. Table where bread remained overnight, beds that were still theirs in the morning, a mother who never demanded they call her one. George protected Margaret, not because an orc woman needed saving from men. Margaret was stronger than him. She could fight better, carry more, endure cold longer, but strength could not repair a pipe while holding a lantern. Strength could not drag a wounded man and protect 2 children at the same time. Strength could not hold both ends of a rope. They had stopped confusing loneliness with strength. That was what winter had really broken. Years later, the old handcart still sat in the shed. Margaret tried to burn it every spring. It is broken, I know. It is ugly, I know. It has mice. Historic mice, she growled. George ran one hand over the worn handle. It carried everything I had left. Margaret looked toward the yard. Alfie was taller. Now Maisie chased chickens. Near them, a younger child with green skin, tiny white tusks, and George's grey eyes sat in the grass. The child had come later, after another winter and many quiet choices, and neither Margaret nor George ever treated that new life as replacement for the ones they had lost. Margaret touched the cart. No. George frowned. No, what? This did not carry everything you had left. What did it miss? She looked at their children. Everything you had not found yet. George smiled. You have become sentimental. You caused it. Can we keep the cart? No, Margaret. It has mice. Historic. I will hit you. The cart survived another year. So did the 2 tin cups beside the stove. So did Walter's hammer. So did Charlotte's leather strap. So did the wind wall. Every first frost. The family walked Frostwater Hollow together. They checked the hay crib, water drain, roof braces, guide ropes, red marker. Posed up barn entrance, willow weave. Alfie carried the ledger. Maisie carried a stick and called it a hammer. Their youngest rode on Margaret's shoulders. Sometimes. Mabel joined to criticize everything. Cedric arrived later and quietly corrected the things she had criticized. Incorrectly. Before the first snow, George always asked the same question. Ready? Margaret always answered, no. Good. Why good? Because anyone who thinks they are completely ready for winter has missed something. Then Margaret would pull him closer by his coat and press one kiss to the side of his neck. George's eyes would close. Inspection. Yes, necessary. Critical. She would kiss his shoulder. Alfie would groan. We can see you. Margaret never cared. George always laughed, and tomorrow's bread remained openly on the table. That became the truest measure of everything. Frostwater Hollow had become winter never showed. Mercy, grief never vanished. Love did not stop arguments. Romance did not repair walls. Strength did not prevent chaos. But a human widower had once arrived at an orc widow's gate with 2 starving children and a ridiculous promise. Feed my children, "And I'll protect you." Margaret fed them. George stayed. At first, she believed he could fix the barn. After that, she stopped needing to name what he was becoming. She handed him Walter's. Hammer trusted him with Alfie, and Maisie put his name beside hers in the ledger, held the other end of his rope, and when Whitehorn swallowed him, the truth came without argument. George Fletcher had become her hope long before she admitted she wanted one. Years later, another Whitehorn warning crossed the valley, this time no ranch. Panicked, Blackwell land had red marker posts. Mabel had 30 days of food and enough extra for 3 neighbors. Cedric's winter guide hung inside every major barn. Frostwater Hollow's wall had been rebuilt stronger. The evening before the storm, George stood beside Margaret outside their house. Snow had just begun. He reached for her hand. She let him. For a moment neither spoke. Then George raised her hand and kissed her knuckles. Margaret lowered her mouth to his, neck warm against the cold, then his shoulder behind them. Their children shouted that supper was ready. George looked toward the open doorway. Warm light spilled across the first clean snow. Margaret watched him. "What?" George smiled. "I was remembering Alfie hiding bread." Her expression softened. "He has not done that in years." "I know." "Then why think about it?" George looked through the doorway, at Alfie setting the table, at Maisie arguing with her younger sibling, at bread resting openly beside the stew. "I wanted to see the tomorrow he finally believed would come." Margaret squeezed his fingers together. They walked toward the house. The door closed behind them. The wind rose over Frostwater Hollow, and winter became nothing more than weather outside, a home strong enough to hold. If Margaret and George's journey stayed with you, subscribe to Orc Saga for more Orc X human romances built on loyalty, choice, and survival. And before you leave, tell me in the comments which moment made them a family for you. The first bowl of milk, Alfie leaving bread on the table, or Margaret holding the other end of George's rope.